All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'll give people a few minutes to filter in before we get started. Just as that happens, I want to note that this webinar is being recorded. It'll be available for streaming on demand from the ASFI website shortly after the event. There will be Q&A following our panel discussion, so please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function. And just a reminder to please stay on mute unless you are speaking. All right, we will kick off. So welcome everybody. Before we begin, as is customary, I want to acknowledge that I am joining you from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people here in glorious Canberra. I want to extend my respects to First Nations people on the line today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'm especially looking forward to hearing from Professor Dean Saunders on First Nations in finance a little later. For those of you really paying attention, you'll notice that I am not ASFI's CEO, Christy Graham. Christy was meant to be moderating today. She did make it back safely from COP30 in Belém this week, but has had an unexpected family commitment, and so I'm stepping in for her. So my name is Purdy. I'm ASFI's Executive Manager for Policy and Blended Finance, and it's my pleasure to be here today to launch ASFI's 2025 Sustainable Finance Progress Tracker report, and to hear from experts from across the finance sector about the wins, the challenges, and the forward priorities for mobilising capital across climate, nature, and social wellbeing in Australia and around the globe. Today's webinar will feature an overview by me of the key findings from this year's Progress Tracker report, followed by what promises to be a really insightful panel discussion from our fantastic panelists. But to kick us off with an overview of the state of sustainable finance, it's my pleasure to introduce Mark Robinson. Mark is Head of Climate Technical Advisory at NAB. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Purdy, and thanks for ASFI for having me on today. I am going to share some material that has been compiled from our corporate institutional bank and our business and private bank that provides a bit of a market update. Now, prefacing this, I'm just going to touch briefly on NAB's updated sustainability priorities. And we've pivoted these and developed them reflective of the market that we're seeing evolving, with our strategic priorities remaining on climate, housing affordability, and First Nations, with corresponding ambitions and targets of $80 billion environmental financing ambition, $60 billion housing affordability financing ambition to 2030, which has recently been updated, and $1 billion lending ambition to First Nations businesses and community organisations by next year. So pivoting that into what we're seeing in the market, looking at global sustainable debt issuance, we are seeing a really solid year despite the US-led greenlash against global ESG and sustainability agendas, with issuance in 2025 likely to match or potentially exceed 2024 volumes. It's lagging behind the pace of global debt issuance, especially earlier in the year. Green bonds, including securitizations, will remain the leading GSSS issuance format, surpassing what we saw last year, and closely followed by social bonds. We are seeing a step away from sustainability-linked debt issuance, with volumes plummeting for SLBs and SLLs this year, and that's lower than any of the previous 4 years. Transition finance volumes in debt issuance are still relatively minimal outside of Japan, and that reflects a lack of clarity and criteria for transition finance. But as we'll sort of touch on, that's anticipated to change with the recent releases from ICMA, LMA, and regional taxonomies. So looking at Australia, the picture is a little stronger. Australian debt issuance in 2025 is on track to surpass the highs of last year, as investors and lenders to continue to support that format in AUD. 2025 volumes again, driven by semi-gov and SSA issuers across sustainability, green and social formats, together with green loan financing activity. Similarly, this year we're seeing a further pullback in sustainability-linked loan issuance and no SLB issuance so far to date. The discussions that we're having with our customers in the corporate institutional part of the bank, as well as the business and private part of the bank, are kind of highlighted here with strong topics on and perhaps gossip on NZBA and climate alliances as everybody tries to figure out what's happening and what that means. Obviously, that's kind of followed up by geopolitics and the mandatory climate reporting requirements coming into play next year. And then, consistent with what we've seen in previous years, there's a lot of questions and discussions around investor perspectives, greenwashing and green hushing, sustainability strategies, especially in lieu of some of the other discussion points that we've been seeing. Nature and biodiversity have been particularly strong, as well as climate risk targets and transition planning. And a lot of these are sort of linked back through to some of the changes and work that's being done around mandatory climate reporting. So looking at market developments, globally, looking at the transition loan guidance, and this is something I sort of briefly touched on earlier, the Guide to Transition Loans being published in 2025, seeking to provide some clarification there on what constitutes transition loan financing. ICMA's Climate Transition Bond Guidelines, released in Tokyo in November, introduces a new climate transition bond label under the ICMA principles. Net Zero Banking Alliance has pivoted the purpose and structure of their organisation. I wouldn't necessarily say folds, but that's really pivoted to a non-binding guidance framework, which has been largely it's not provided much of an interruption, given most of the banks that were looking to take action under NZBA have the majority of their targets in place, and so the pivot to being a guidance body has not really provided much interruption or disruption from a financing perspective. The Climate Bond Standard has been updated to version 4.3 with the inclusion of their resilience criteria and resilience taxonomy. The ICMA principles and guidance were released, updated in June 2025, including sustainable bonds for nature. Now, locally, we have the first green bond issued under the taxonomy for VPN. The Australian taxonomy aligned green bond guidance is being developed, which we're all anticipating early next year. And the US-Australian bilateral framework on critical minerals and rare earths, which was announced in October 2025 to secure supply and further develop that industry. The NABERS Sustainable Finance Criteria version 2 has been updated, which is further developing the steps they took in their original guidance and incorporating the ASFI taxonomy release, and the first projects registered under the nature repair market. I will briefly touch on a couple of these, but I'm really going to leave the regulatory and policy developments to Purdy. There's the ISSB nature-related financial disclosure updates, which were of interest. The UK Treasury dropping its plans for the UK taxonomy. The Treasury consultation on investment product labels, which has been of particular interest to financial institutions this year. and the ongoing pilot and work on the sustainable finance taxonomy, and of course, the mandatory climate reporting preparations for January 1. So that's it. I've kind of barnstormed my way through the presentation there, but there is obviously time for further discussion and updates to sort of contextualize a little bit of that.
Thanks, Mark, and we'll absolutely come back to you. But I think it's some really interesting trends that we are seeing ongoing resilience in the sustainable finance labelled debt markets, but really a trend towards the green bonds and those really established, where we have these established frameworks as opposed to the sustainability linked loans. So keen to revisit a few of those topics with you shortly. But for right now, I'm very pleased to officially launch the Sustainable Finance Progress Tracker, which is now available on the ASFI website. If you head to www.asfi.org.au and click on the banner that will be there on the homepage, you can download a copy. Next slide, please, Jamie. So, but just a bit of background on what the Progress Tracker is. We've done this every year since ASFI's inception, and to date, it has been an assessment of progress against the original industry sustainable finance roadmap. This year, at the beginning of this year, and we worked very closely and collaborated across the financial system with our partners and members and other financial institutions to do a bit of a refresh of that roadmap, recognising that a lot has happened over the years since it was released in 2020. And what we produced was the 2025 to 27 Sustainable Finance Action Plan, and a bit of a snapshot of the action plan kind of goals is on your screen right now. It identifies 26 priority actions across 8 domains, including policy, regulatory alignment, national targets, data, innovation, leadership and culture, capability, and international engagement. Importantly, the plan is not just something that ASFI would be responsible for delivering, but it really is intended to capture the system as a whole and all of those pieces, and is something that different organisations across the system will be more focused on particular areas and delivery of those across public and private sectors. So this is the first year that we are reporting on progress against the action plan. And the purpose of the progress tracker, as always, is to take stock of progress on where we are, to provide a clear view of what's working, what remains unresolved, and what needs to happen next to really scale capital for climate, nature, and social impact across Australia and beyond. So the headline findings, I'll give you a quick overview. Sort of in a year marked by geopolitical turbulence and a reversal of US climate leadership, sustainable capital flows have shown resilience, which is consistent with what we just heard from Mark. In the real economy, we've got global capital surging into clean energy, with investment hitting $2.2 trillion in 2024, which was twice the spend on oil, gas, and coal combined. China continues to dominate in clean energy, responsible for nearly a third of global investment in that sector and half of global EV sales. And this activity from the world's second largest economy and largest emitter of greenhouse gases really does signal that the world's economic direction of travel remains green. Next slide, please. US volatility has unsettled global sentiment. We've also seen recalibration of sustainable finance regulation underway in Europe. Nevertheless, the vast majority of countries remain committed to net zero by 2050. We've also seen updated nationally determined contributions come forward, setting out 2035 emissions targets ahead of COP30 that's currently underway. Credible analysis translate those to a temperature increase consistent with between 1.8 and 2.3 degrees from pre-industrial levels. So that's obviously not consistent with the 1.5 degree temperature goal, but it's nevertheless far below the 3.5 degree path that was projected at the time the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. So this again is an unmistakable sign of progress. That said, we know that every fraction of a degree of temperature increase carries escalating climate risks, and there is a lot more to do and some significant challenges. Just taking the renewables sector, we need to almost triple investment globally to hit net zero by 2050. And in this sector, Australia and many other countries are facing persistent deployment challenges. Slow planning and permitting, grid congestion, transmission delays, interconnection challenges, as well as organised opposition campaigns that are showing up in communities across the country and the globe. These have the effect of slowing down projects and increasing risk and cost for investors. In the Australian landscape, the Australian government has staked its future on decarbonisation and Australia's sort of economic prospects on decarbonising the economy. But we've got a lag in the policy setting. So in October, as I'm sure many of you will have been tracking, the government announced its 2035 emissions target, announcing a range of 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. And generally that's been seen as fairly credible, particularly at the upper range of that target. The government has a really strong narrative around climate and its and the relationship between decarbonisation and Australia's future economic prosperity. And the accompanying net zero plan has really clarified the intended decarbonisation pathways. But there are some pretty significant gaps. So even on the government's own emissions projections, there's an 11% gap in 2035 to achieving even the lower bound of the target. And it doesn't clearly set out how that gap will be closed through future policy reforms, although it does point to the NEM review that it's underway, as well as the Safeguard Mechanism review, which will take place next year as being key areas for potential reforms to close that gap. We've also got some mixed signals across government on the role of gas in the economy and a lack of bipartisan commitment to net zero and interim targets, which does leave some uncertainty for lenders and investors. Next slide, please. Globally, in the harder to abate sectors, industrial sectors, we've seen competition start to heat up. Sectors like steel, aluminium and cement, we've seen projects accelerating. There's more than 1,000 clean industrial projects in development with $142 billion in investment-ready projects awaiting final financing. We've got a lot of commentary in Australia, including from the government, about our strong comparative advantage and particularly seen as a kind of prospective producer of green iron for export, but currently only 6 of the 70 investment-ready projects outside of China are in Australia. Most of the others are in Sunbelt countries that actually share Australia's natural advantages, including in the Middle East. So the sort of implication there is that without a step change in effort, Australia will fall further behind. And that is a risk to our future export revenues as our fossil fuel exports inevitably decline. Adaptation continues to be underinvested globally. The government released its National Climate Risk Assessment in October this year, which is a really sobering read, laying bare the scope and severity of potential physical impacts in Australia, impacts which we are already starting to feel. And while the case for investment in adaptation is compelling and Australia's National Adaptation Plan recognises the need to mobilise more private capital into adaptation and resilience, it doesn't yet take the concrete steps towards supporting that investment. Nature investment also continues to lag, despite increasingly clear kind of quantification and understanding of the risks that are involved with continued destruction of nature and failure to restore. And there was a fantastic study by the UK's Green Finance Institute showing that in the UK, nature shocks could cut GDP by more than the global financial crisis or COVID-19. And many of these losses happen from supply chains outside of the UK that Australia would also be exposed to. In Australia, half of our GDP depends on natural systems. And the nature repair market that was introduced by the government early in 2025 is unlikely to protect or restore nature at the scale required without stronger baseline environmental regulation. We've got reforms to Australia's federal environmental laws that have been proposed by government but remain subject to negotiations through Parliament. So one to watch. This one was very interesting to see this feature top of your word cloud, Mark, but amid anti-ESG pressure and in response to litigation risk, financial institutions have become more cautious in their public sustainability commitments and messaging, and this is evident in the unraveling of major net zero alliances. This, could also reflect a move from a shift into the next phase of the transition. We're moving from a phase of kind of high-level commitments into one that's really focused on the detail of implementation, and that can be really context-specific. Nevertheless, we're seeing core climate practice continue. Climate risk and opportunity remain central to good governance and to long-term returns. That fact has not changed, just no matter what happens in the political arena. And that means that financial institutions continue to integrate climate risks. They continue to support customers and portfolio companies to decarbonise and continue to invest in fast-growing clean industries. In Australia, new mandatory climate disclosure rules are a key focus for financial institutions and for other reporting entities. And those rules came into effect for the largest Australian businesses on the 1st of January this year. This is a summary of the action plan scorecard results, and I won't go through all of them. Some of them we've already touched on, but just to call out a few areas of strong progress. So the release of the 2035 target has given greater level of certainty, although there's work to do on the enabling policies. We've seen the launch of the Australian taxonomy, which has been well received by the market, and Mark mentioned the first taxonomy aligned bond that was issued successfully earlier this year. Government has steadily progressed implementation of its sustainable finance roadmap, including consultations on product labelling and transition plan guidance. We've also seen some really strong examples of multi-sector partnerships, including in work led by the First Nations Clean Energy Network. Mandatory disclosure implementation is progressing, and we've seen the ASFI announce its plans to develop disclosure standards for nature. In moderate progress, I think we've heard that the government has heard strong feedback on the Your Super performance test constraints on super fund investment in sustainability and other opportunities, and it's exploring reform options. On the weak side, we have not seen moves towards broader kind of policy and regulation, so no progress on carbon pricing or other key tools that could tilt the balance in favour of green and shift it away from legacy opportunities. So in particular, we have not seen green capital weightings under discussion or the introduction of climate and sustainability into directors' duties. We also haven't seen digital disclosures progress, notwithstanding the fact that the Productivity Commission has recommended this as a key way to support productivity in the economy. And across the board, we're not really seeing financial institutions, with this anti-ESG backdrop, really move towards formally embedding sustainability into corporate purpose statements. And with some exceptions, including in the First Nations space, which has actually been really bright lights, we're not seeing significant new sustainability targets in the finance sector. Priorities for the year ahead. I'm going to whip through these and please take a look at the executive summary, at least of the report, to read more about this. But there is a clear need to strengthen climate policy and carbon pricing in particular. An opportunity to expand the Australian taxonomy, and a lot of support to do that with adaptation and resilience being the priority, and to lean in on the transition finance, sort of emerging transition finance frameworks globally. So more international engagement, given Australia's strong position on transition finance through the taxonomy. Opportunity to scale up blended finance, particularly for adaptation and nature, as well as First Nations, to use the EPBC Act reforms, the environmental legislation reforms to streamline environmental approvals and strengthen, but also strengthen baseline environmental protection. We would like to see the government explore tools to tilt the cost of capital in favour of green, including through green prudential settings for banks. We need a bigger capability lift across the financial system and better integration of sustainability across organisational culture and performance frameworks. And on the green export side, Australia, as I mentioned, risks losing ground in the global race for green markets. So there's been lots of great ideas put out over the last 12 months in particular on ways to remedy this and policy solutions. And the call here is for government to develop a coordinated national strategy for Australia's clean exports. All right. With that whirlwind, I'm going to now introduce our panel to make sense of this and really inject their own perspectives. We have Professor Dean Saunders, OAM, who is ASFI board advisor and a First Nations leader. You've heard from Mark Robinson already. We have Ange Nichols, Climate Governance Initiative Australia lead and Senior Policy Advisor from the Insurance Council of Australia, and Frankie Muscovich, Executive Director of Policy at the Investor Group on Climate Change. Please remember to put your Q&A into the Q&A function. You can put your answers if you like, but put your questions into the Q&A function as we go along. And I do want to start, Frankie, with you because you are joining us live from COP30 in Belém, where we have heard this morning that Adelaide will not host COP31 in 2026, despite Australia having been bidding for the right to host this event for the past 3 years. So, Frankie, what is the latest on the ground?
Thanks, Purdy, and really good to be with you all. And I wish I had better news to be reporting to you from here in Belém. It has been a very long and protracted day of negotiations, and where we've landed, and I should sort of stress that there are some complex arrangements that are going to be put in place in the coming days that aren't yet fully detailed. So what we have at the moment is a briefing that myself and other stakeholders here on the ground received directly from Minister Bowen after he made his media statement earlier. So it looks like whilst Australia enjoyed the vast majority of support from the grouping of nations that are due to decide who hosts the next COP, this process is founded on consensus, and I think what we're seeing here, unfortunately, is a real shortcoming in the process that's allowed this sort of situation to develop, if you like. And so Minister Bowen and his Turkish counterpart have been in we heard from him in negotiations for 2 days straight, in bilateral negotiations, that is. And what was made very clear to us was that Turkey, if Australia had asked the Western Europe and other nations grouping, so WEOG, I know there's a bit of acronyms and shorthand in some of this, to press for a vote and vote Australia to host the COP, that they would have used their right, as any nation can, to veto that decision on the floor at the final closing plenary when the overall package and sort of decision is put to the full set of parties. So I think put in obviously a very awkward situation, and I think what has been salvaged here is really the Australian government trying to make the best of the situation, and in seeing that letting the hosting rights revert to Bonn, which would result in a more kind of procedural small COP, would have been a worse outcome in the Australian government's view, and that's because you wouldn't see a president appointed over that COP until shortly before the actual negotiations start. And under this agreement that we've got in front of us, it'll see Australia, and I don't know that it will say Minister Bowen in the decision text that's adopted by parties, but he will be the COP president for negotiations. So Turkey will still be the COP president. So it's a split presidency, and this nature of arrangement is unprecedented in the process. We have had situations where other countries have acted as COP president whilst the physical COP is hosted in another country, but this is not that. So Turkey will host the physical COP in Antalya, and they will be responsible, importantly, for the action agenda. And that I think really speaks to probably one of the, I think the disappointing outcomes here from an Australian perspective, because all of the buzz and the work that goes into the lead up to a COP. So events, pushes for global pledges, like we've had, huge success through adoption of initiatives out of the action agenda into the negotiations themselves in previous years, like the commitment to triple renewable energy generation and double energy efficiency improvements being one good example of that. So that will rest with the Turkish presidency, and whilst they've said they will consult with Australia, like there's nothing sort of written down on paper that guarantees us a very strong say in that. I do think it is significant if it is confirmed in this way that we will hold the pen on the presidency when it comes to the negotiations. So that means that when the presidency is consulting with all the parties at the COP on what goes in, the big decision text that tells the world what the outcome of these talks are. That would be Minister Bowen coordinating that, and he would be responsible for appointing ministerial pairs that lead negotiation tracks, a lot of other technical work that goes on during the COP. So if that is to be confirmed, that is a significant role, and I think we should focus on, really seizing the opportunity in some of that. Maybe the only other thing I'll say is that we also will see a pre-COP delivered in the Pacific, and I really do want to highlight the importance of I think, Australia in partnership with the Pacific really leaning in to make the absolute best and biggest deal of that possible. So pre-COPs are usually small gatherings, but there's nothing to say that we could put, a lot of effort in to make that a really significant summit. And I think in doing that, really seek to highlight the needs and asks of the Pacific, including a flagship initiative in the Pacific Resilience Fund, which is an initiative that Australia is supporting. So, I mean, there's obviously a lot of other things I could say, but I'll pause there, and because I'm conscious that I'm sure there's lots of other things to get through, but yeah, like, happy to field any questions if there are some obvious ones.
Thank you so much, Frankie, for giving us that hot take from the ground. And I think I and many people would share your sense that it is a disappointing result, and that the loss of the action agenda in particular is a bit of a blow. That is where the focus of ASFI's kind of COP31 member working group and steering committee has been, because a lot of the interesting things from a finance and investment perspective don't happen in the formal negotiations. They happen through these sort of exciting collaborative initiatives that happen on the side. That said, there's no reason why many of these initiatives can't continue to take place. And if Australia has that kind of elevated role of COP president and is seen as kind of having convening power by virtue of that, and is really sort of deeply involved over the next 12 months. There's a lot of like really great proposals that, Frankie, I know you've been working on, that we've been working on with many others across the ecosystem that are still really good, and even in the absence of any COP are kind of sensible, no regrets opportunities. So, as things wash out, then I think that's the area to be continuing to focus on. I want to move now into sort of to broaden the discussion once again. This is the latest development in what has been a really eventful year in climate and sustainability in Australia and around the globe. So keen to hear from each panel member on how you're seeing progress or headwinds on sustainable finance and investment from your unique vantage points. And I'm going to come to you first. The Insurance Council is deeply involved in climate change analysis and advocacy, and has really been leading the sector's collaborative efforts on this. How are you seeing developments over the past 12 months from an insurance perspective?
Thanks, Purdy, and lovely to be here today. So from an insurance perspective, I guess that there's been really meaningful progress over the last 12 months around the dialogue around adaptation investment. And that's sort of underpinned by a strengthening of the relationship between the insurance industry and government. So one of the most significant shifts we've seen over the past 12 months is a real maturing national conversation around the need to address decades of underinvestment in climate adaptation. So as we just heard from you, Purdy, we had the National Climate Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Plan released, both of which were welcomed by the insurance industry because they provide sort of a holistic view of all the climate risk perils across the country. And then just on Monday, we had the Commonwealth Government release the third round of the federal government's Disaster Ready Fund. So that provided adaptation funding for over 180 projects, which is great. And then earlier this year, we had the ICA launch our Flood Defence Fund, which is a 10-year, $30 billion mitigation fund, which will target flood resilience in the 24 highest flood zones that we've identified up and down the east coast of Australia. So that's real progress that we're seeing around sort of a slow but hopefully accelerating investment in climate adaptation. And yeah, that's sort of been underpinned by really strong relationships and dialogues between industry and government with APRA, with the Climate Vulnerability Assessment, which when finished will provide a view of how the insurance industry will operate under a couple of different climate scenarios. And then we also have the Hazards Insurance Partnership, where we're working with government to really develop a strong nationwide view of climate risk across the perils, so bushfire, cyclone, flood, for example, and then that will help guide government's investment in those adaptation measures. So that's sort of the good news. I guess we are still experiencing headwinds like any industry. The escalating cost of extreme weather events is still a major concern. Recent analysis by the ICA showed that we are only second in the world to the United States in terms of per capita natural catastrophe costs. And by 2050, the cost insured losses from natural extreme weather events will be in the hallmark of around $35 billion a year, which is a terrifying number. And so what that kind of means is that we're very conscious that the protection gap, so that's the gap between what people have in terms of insurance and the cost of recovering from these extreme weather events, that is growing not just in Australia but globally. So we are making progress. It's been a good year of progress around trying to solve those solutions with government and progressing adaptation resilience. But at the same time, we really need to keep that momentum up because the pace of these extreme weather events and the cost of them is escalating further than our current progress.
Thanks, Ange. I think ICA has really moved the needle in terms of the understanding, the quantification of the longer term impacts, and that really focusing attention on the value of investments. And your proposal for a $2 billion resilience program that would deliver more than $19 billion in savings by 2050 features in our progress tracker. But the sort of challenge is that sometimes the returns on those investments don't accrue to the people directly that are spending the money, and really the important role of government in policy reforms, but also putting in place the frameworks to support private capital to invest in the most sensible places and to identify those areas that can make a return. I'm going to come now to you, Dean. The progress tracker reveals some really bright points on First Nations in finance over the past 12 months. Keen to get your views. Oh, you're on mute though.
I was so busy wrestling with the camera that I forgot to turn myself on to
Camera
audio.
looks great. It's zoomed in on you.
No. I am having trouble with the camera. It's not sufficiently distant. I can see myself way too clearly. But look, I do want to step into that conversation about First Nations, but I also want to make sure that we're because you've asked the question about the idea of sort of a sense of progress and action. And I have to say, listening to the team, listening to Francesca and yourself and Ange, of course, talk about, and Mark's earlier propositions on where we think we're at in this particular conversation, I can't help but be reminded that the 140 odd souls that have joined into this conversation, congratulations, by the way, for those mob who've decided to give up their lunch or whatever sustenance you're presently meant to be involved in to participate in this call. But you're here for a reason. You're here because this stuff matters to you. It matters to you in your organisation. It matters to you in the way you work, or maybe even to the hundreds of people who sit behind you in your teams. But we are speaking a strange language, and I've just really been listening to that in the conversation we've had already this afternoon. And I think we can get very much caught up. This is the Indigenous perspective on everything, not just the Indigenous perspective on the current results in our particular markets around this, is that we often obfuscate, we often hide behind complex languages and policies and numbers and data, and we use that as a way of disconnecting us from the truth of these types of experiences. And I think that's a real risk in these conversations. So I want to make sure that when we talk about First Nations perspectives on these things, we're often talking about the truth of what it means to be responsible for country, to be responsible for your survival. I want to really understand this and underpin this for everybody here. And Purdy, you've done a beautiful job of sticking a big picture of some country there behind you. But you are, of course, and everybody in this call is on country from somewhere. I'm joining you from Gadigal, in what is obviously a barren-looking office space, because I'm not sitting on country presently. And even I feel the disconnection of that in the space of sitting here. But I want to make sure that we're understanding this properly. When we say things like 50% of our economic system depends on nature, I just want to really make sure everybody's sitting with the truth. And that 100% of our life depends on nature. Not 50, it doesn't matter about 50% of the economic system, it's 100% of your lives, of your children's lives, of your grandchildren's lives depend on nature, depend on how we address these issues in the context of climate change. And so when we talk about First Nations actions, we're not really talking about First Nations actions in the context of the financial services systems or financial product systems or policy settings. We're talking about the issue of how is it that we care for our responsibilities in the context of nature, country. But the good news for all of you on that front is that we are doing that. We are taking charge of that because, frankly, we're not waiting around for government policy. We cannot any longer wait around for government policy. Well, I'd love to see us, as somebody who spent a lot of their life in the financial services, in the markets and the regulatory spaces, I would love to see us activate all of the engines of change that are part of this particular tool set. But we're not waiting for it. So the sort of solutions we are seeing are driven by the necessities of communities taking charge of their responsibilities for caring for country, for adapting in the context of Angela's conversation, for responding to sort of mitigating the risks that we see situating in our landscapes. They're not being done because the financial market incentives exist. They're being done because we have responsibility to care for country. We want to see you mob line up behind that, but frankly, we're not waiting for those particular solutions. That's a global conversation. I'm sure that Francesca's heard versions of that in Brazil too. It's not just a story here in Australia. And an example of that is that the reason we aren't waiting for government policy or financial markets is because we don't have a lot of faith in that. It won't surprise anybody in this call that most Aboriginal people in this country don't think the answers lie in the hands of government. Most of our problems come from the hands of government, which is part of the reasons. I mean, the example, for instance, of COP31 is interesting. I hear the lament, I hear the sadness. I can tell you, I don't care. It doesn't matter. It does not matter to us because, in fact, it's true that COP31 would have obviously incentivized local and global organizational involvement. That would have been exciting. We would have had more players at the table, more voices in conversation, more investment flowing. But we do need to, I think, avoid in this nation sort of political platforms for dialogue and start focusing on political platforms of action. How do we actually respond to these things practically? And I want to, in this conversation, put that challenge to this audience, to this marketplace, that the government policy isn't the answer. Governments have never made markets. Financial participants make markets. Investors make markets. Governments have never made markets. They can underpin them. They can provide risk mitigation. They can provide policy guardrails. They can do all those types of things. But investors and risk and bravery make markets. So the call for now we are absolutely happy. We, as you know, in this nation have 70% of this land mass is ours to manage or under sort of curatorial responsibilities. We are ready to do that, and we are showing that in our communities, in our landscape and native title positions. We need you to get behind those solutions, to start radically inventing new systems. So that's not a negative story, by the way. That's not a story of we're waiting for government policy and gee, isn't it a shame? When it is a story of us taking self-determination for your safety, for your children and grandchildren's safety. What we need from you are solutions that fit into that particular paradigm. And I'm excited about that. I see action on that. But the most voices of success I see are not because we did something, this market did something, but because our communities did something. And I want you to be involved in that story. I will say, though, it's obviously incumbent upon me to say that I am excited for what we can do together in this marketplace. I'm excited for what the financial services, what our innovative financial product systems can do, how we can start to create change in that. But let's not wait for government policy. I've joined ASFI in that sort of board advisory role because I believe deeply in the power of markets. I believe in our capacity to invent and innovate, but we have to do the invention and we have to do the innovation. And that's what I'm in this conversation for.
Oh, thank you, Dean. And I mean, they're just a perfect example of why we're so delighted that you've come on as board advisor and as mentor for us here at ASFI. I think a really important reminder of just the centrality of country and of nature to our life and call to action. And I will come back to you to identify, what's the most important kind of tangible step in a moment. But I'm going to come to you next, Mark. You've given us the sort of the stats and the overview, but what's your sort of read of what all that means for the banking sector and for NAB going forward?
Yeah, thank you. some great responses so far. It's quite hard to follow that up, but following from some of the things that Ange has said there, we see a strong focus on and desire to push into transition and adaptation and resilience. We see an enormous amount of opportunity, obviously with ASFI looking to expand the taxonomy to address adaptation and resilience as an environmental objective next year. And if we, overlay that with some of the scale that we're seeing in the semi-government and SSA issuance sector, where a lot of the critical infrastructure is located that is going to be subject to some of those adaptation and resilience investments, there's an awful lot of opportunity there for the market. Similarly, looking at the other end of the spectrum, at the moment as we approach mandatory reporting, financial institutions are deeply reflecting on the climate risks that affect their portfolios and their customers. We are learning an incredible amount about how that risk is expected to manifest under different climate scenarios. And importantly, the interplay between levels of insurance, the risk that is faced by financial institutions, and really looking for pathways forward about how we can help our customers approach some of those risks and how we can approach them as an organisation. And so to that end, managing some of those adaptation and resilience risks and opportunities will continue to remain a focus for us to try and understand how we can help customers of all scales really grasp those opportunities and mitigate some of those risks. In the transition space, we're seeing a lot of appetite to look further through the issue of transition. We've seen updates to the LMA and ICMA principles around that. There, is some opportunity in the near future with ASFI to start looking more closely at how transition can be braced by the existing energy sources that we have. There is a desire there to try and understand how some conventional energy sources really fit into this in some sort of credible sense. And that is, to this point, still an unanswered question and something that, people are very passionate about, something that we collectively need to address. And that's going to involve, public and private sectors there. As we face into taxonomies, everybody's very excited about the new Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy and how it addresses sustainable finance in the Australian context. There are still opportunities for improvement in terms of data availability that we need to continue exploring. We've seen how successful proxies for sustainable finance have been over the last 10 years. Green Buildings, Neighbours, GBCA, and other benchmarks have really opened the floodgates and allowed financial markets to provide the investment at an immense scale to address climate change mitigation. The same can be achieved for adaptation and resilience as well. And finally, we're seeing, continued focus and interest in natural capital and its role in future environmental markets and tradable commodities. I'm sure I've missed a bunch there, but that feels like a good place to stop.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think everything that you've said sort of underscores this idea that we're really in the nitty-gritty phase of implementation, where it's about like tweaking those dials and moving towards in a really practical level. I think also to reflect what Dean has said, genuinely taking the steps and kind of continuing with the action on implementation. Whether that's, government policy is one thing, but on the frameworks that will help us and the way that individual institutions are working individually as well as together to take this forward. Frankie, I'm going to come back to you. So just, putting the COP31 bid to one side, you are at COP30 and you've been there for the last week or so. How is this informing your view of progress on climate and sustainability investment over the past 12 months?
Thanks, Bertie. And I just want to pick up on what Dean was talking about before. And just to reiterate, actually, one of the most grounding things about being here has been the presence of First Nations people from the Amazon protesting, but being present, making their voices heard here on the ground. And actually, I think it's really significant that the work that they have done in partnership and alliance forming with other groups here has really forced the conversation around a just transition and bringing everyone along for the ride to include a big push and global pledge on fossil fuel phase outs, which has gained a lot of support from countries here on the ground. And I just wanted to kind of highlight and really sort of honor what Dean was saying there, because that has felt very significant being here, as you've sort of said, at times feeling a bit disconnected from, the country that you're standing on, running around listening to technical conversations. All of that said, I mean, I think the goings on in the last couple of weeks here really honestly don't alter the fundamentals of what we need to be getting on with in Australia and our transition. I think there obviously is an opportunity, and sort of what lies ahead that we would hope to leverage and use to accelerate process when it comes to, getting the settings right to enable that, investment to flow, because we need significantly more of it into our market if we're going to achieve the level of emissions reduction and that the rate of decarbonisation we've set for ourselves in that target. So what is top of mind for me, and Ange and Mark and Dean have touched on the importance of adaptation, and that is really very much at the forefront of discussions here. And I think when and it's certainly in the context of finance and the availability of finance, particularly for support for developing countries from developed countries to unlock investment. When I think about what that means, for us back at home in Australia, I think we have a much more fleshed out and developed agenda on the mitigation side of things. and we've not yet really replicated that sort of the sophistication of that policy architecture that we will need if we're going to get all the adaptation done that we need doing. And so from my perspective, and obviously working with Australia's superannuation industry as well as global asset owners and managers, I think the task ahead of us is to properly define what the role of public finance needs to be in unlocking and crowding in private capital for adaptation. And we're not there yet. So there are helpful kind of nods at potential actions in the National Adaptation Plan, and probably not firm enough commitments to do some of the things listed in there. Just to give a couple of examples that haven't been touched on by other speakers. I think we've got this ecosystem of special investment vehicles, and I think like one really key role for governments here, and I've sort of already mentioned it on the way through, is that de-risking element. In investments, and adaptation in some ways is new territory, and we haven't seen significant amounts of institutional capital go into adaptation. We know that needs to happen into the future. And so the role of our special investment vehicles then becomes very important because they have significant allocations of capital that will be necessary to de-risk some of that investment. So I think, in terms of the nearer term policy agenda, I think a focus on what can be done there to leverage the architecture that we've got in place and allow CIVs like the CEFC and others to play a role in adaptation. That's a sort of first cab off the rank, and then I think we're looking at a bit of a gaps analysis on resilience and adaptation finance, and I know others have touched on blended finance and things like that. So there are definitely things there. I think the other, thing I would say on ambition, like it's odd in one sense to have come from back home where many of us were perhaps hoping for a much higher target when it came to the 2035 emissions reduction target, and yet here that is actually seen as globally pretty near the front of the pack. So I guess what I'm saying is, although it's not everything we might have hoped for, the direction of travel is very clear, and we actually have put a signal out there to the rest of the world that Australia is serious when it comes to the transition, and we should be hoping to attract not just domestic capital, through our banks and super funds, but global capital to really sort of realise the vision of that future made in Australia and play not just the role we need to in decarbonising our domestic industries, but also really leaning into the role that we can play as a regional leader in decarbonising supply chains alongside our key trading partners. And I still very much see the opportunity in that for us in the next little while. But there is policy work required to make that a reality. And that means removing distortionary signals when it comes to investment, like fossil fuel subsidies in place that delay investment in decarbonisation. It means pricing carbon across more of the economy, so that we are sort of tilting the table, I think, as you said, Purdy, towards decarbonisation, as well as putting some really strong demand side signals when it comes to those sort of future growth industries and things like green metals. So anyway, I could go on, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Frankie. I think just a good kind of insight into kind of where the conversations are at globally, but also putting Australia's action into context and outlining some pretty concrete forward steps to focus on. As we're approaching towards time, and I might come to you, there's a question in the chat about what policy settings would most efficiently mobilise private capital into adaptation investment. I know ICA has done a lot of work on this, so I wonder if you can give me, like, very briefly, the top 3 policy asks that you guys have And then tell me, if in 12 months' time, what is the one thing that you would most like to have seen happen?
Yeah, I can narrow it down from 3 to 1. So
Excellent.
the top policy ask is we would really love the government to commit to a long-term pipeline of adaptation projects. These sorts of projects take years to build and to lower the risk to homes and communities. So they really should have been started to be built last decade. So that's our key policy ask. And in terms of doing that, we are working with government. So if they commit to adaptation investment, then we can recognise that in insurance premiums. So kind of coming together and all aligning to have the same outcome, which is to protect these communities that are at high risk from climate.
Thanks, Ange. Is that top policy ask also the one thing that you want to have seen in the last 12 months? They're one and the same? Very efficient.
Especially if they commit to the ICA's Flood Defence Fund, but I won't be choosy.
Okay, excellent. Mark, what's the one thing that you would like most to see take place over the next 12 months?
Wow. To boil it down to a single item on the wish list, we would really like to see adaptation and resilience investment have the framework it requires to really scale up and to try and fill in some of the blanks within the market. That's been a real focus for us. In addition to, further clarification around transition finance, how the taxonomy and other benchmarks could be further expanded and credibly applied to deploy finance at the scale that is necessary.
Great. Oh, two asks close to my own heart, and a bit of a 2-for-1 there. Frankie, you had a bit of a list, so can I ask you to hone it down to your top one thing? If you, in 12 months' time when we're having this chat, what do you hope most will have taken place?
That's so tricky. Look, I think noting that we've got a programmed review of the safeguard mechanism, I think whilst it's disappointing to see the Conservative side of politics sort of opting out of this conversation for the next little while, I do think there's a big opportunity to seek an ambitious expansion of the safeguard mechanism in a way that turns it into a carbon price across much more of the economy, with the prospect of that, morphing into, whether it's an ETS, or just a broader carbon price. I think once those price signals are in there, the markets tend to orient around the right investments, and we don't have the right signals across the full spectrum of the economy yet. So that'd be my one thing to get it the biggest chunk of emissions as possible. Thanks.
Yeah, great call out. And Dean, I wanted to give you the last word because your calls to action are always better than anything that I could hope to deliver. So please tell us.
Well, Manambu, thank you, Purdy, but I don't know in this case that it will be, because I want to actually flip it a little bit, because I think the team has given such great specific policy recommendations, and going along with the ASFI tracker and the sort of policy recommendations you're making, I actually want to sort of encourage the audience to think a bit differently about this as we rapidly lose them for their 2:00 meetings. That I don't think any of the challenges we've seen, and Francesca spoke about the coalition sort of proposition on their position for climate change and net zero. All of those things arise because nobody understands what the hell we're talking about outside of these conversations. The bloodless sort of instrumentalization language we've applied to this is missing the Australian community. We need to understand that in this conversation, we're not just talking to our own market participants and internal operations leaders and public policy experts. We are talking to the Australian population, and we are fundamentally confusing the hell out of them. So my strongest recommendation, I love the idea of a taxonomy, but taxonomy only makes sense to people in this conversation. It doesn't make sense to anybody out in the street. Net zero has been conflated with energy policy, for God's sake, and the cost of living crisis, as though those three things are all the same thing when they are radically different propositions. So I think we need to think differently and quite radically about how we are communicating our relationship to solutions, to the way they affect the markets, because you're all in the solutions game. I wouldn't be waiting for government. That's my one strong advice. give the power back to communities, because there's economic opportunity. There's only three things that I understand people respond to. As an ex-lawyer and regulator, I say people respond to pain, compliance, or opportunity. They're the only three things that people tend to respond to. The opportunity, which is the side that Mark's talking about, how do we create opportunity in this market through those sorts of instruments and tools? But the pain and compliance is all that's driving the conversation right now. We have to educate, and most importantly, I genuinely think we have to educate the media. I don't mean that just in the conversation of this. I mean generally, that if we use the words taxonomy in front of media, then we've lost the entire conversation. What do these things actually mean? How do they impact real human beings in real life? How do they impact real markets and real clients and real solutions? That we've been very encouraged what we should be focusing on for the next 12 months.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Dean, and thank you, everybody. At the heart of ASFI is collaboration. We couldn't do what we do without our members, without our partners, and we look forward to continuing to work with all of you over the next 12 months to unlock progress and continue to build on this momentum, irrespective of the very dynamic and fast-changing kind of global environment that we find ourselves in. Please do take a moment to fill out the survey. We love to get your feedback. And if you, rest assured, if people had to jump off for their 2 o'clock, this webinar will be available to download online. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your days, or Frankie, for you, please get some rest.
Thanks, Purdy. See you later.